Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And every once in a while we have to do one of these. I don't like to emphasize politics too much, but we have to do a political figure, and a political figure I don't like very much. And today it's Fidel Castro, who died recently at the age of 90. Next to Queen Elizabeth, he was the longest reigning ruler in the world, and basically if you liked socialism and communism, you liked Fidel Castro, and if you didn't like him. Well, you know where I stand on this. He took one of the largest economies in the Western Hemisphere and turned it into a place where people were trying to get to the United States by putting 1950 Studebakers in the water and trying to float them 100 miles. For my money, you can always tell about a government whether there are more people trying to get in or trying to get out, and there were definitely more people trying to get out of Cuba. Anyway, here's the BBC4 Last Word with Matthew Bannister. They're trying to be fair, but I think their leanings are always a little to the left of what I would prefer.
Now, the revolutionary Cuban leader Fidel Castro sharply divided opinion. For some, like Orlando Gutierrez of the opposition Cuban Democratic Directorate, he was a disaster for the country.
Así entendemos los revolucionarios cubanos.
What Fidel Castro did in Cuba was betray the dreams of change and the aspiration of liberty of the Cuban people. He suppressed the independent press. He eliminated any legal opposition to the system. He viciously persecuted not just political opponents, but those Cubans who descended from the regime because they were homosexuals, or because they were Catholic, or because they were Jehovah's Witnesses, or because they subscribed to any other than the official dogma that Fidel Castro sought to impose in Cuba.
Así entiende nuestro pueblo sus deberes.
But the former Labour Trade Minister Brian Wilson takes a very different view.
He sent out a beacon of hope to Latin America, which at that time was controlled by American-sponsored dictatorships of the most brutal variety. He educated his people. He gave them health care they'd never had before. But do not lose the bigger picture that Fidel Castro, for his region and for oppressed peoples throughout the world, sent out a message of hope.
Que con combatientes cubanos podré contar el movimiento revolucionario en cualquier rincón de la tierra.
Did Fidel Castro stand out as a leader right from the beginning? Professor Anthony Capacia is director of the Center for Research on Cuba at Nottingham University.
He certainly stood out. I mean, literally, he stood out because of his height and his presence, but also because of the loyalty he began to command amongst people around him.
Police patrol excited crowds in Havana who found that while they slept, behind the scenes, strongman General Batista had overthrown the constitutional regime of President Carlos Prio.
So in 1952, Batista launched a military coup and took power. What was Castro's reaction to that?
He was quite clearly frustrated, but also he, as a lawyer, decided to challenge the coup legally in courts. Needless to say, unsuccessfully, but he challenged it on the grounds that the coup was unconstitutional and that the Constitution was the key thing.
He then took up weapons, the legal challenge having failed.
That's correct.
Sobre la cuestión acerca de si la lucha armada es el único camino.
To the question, why have I taken up an armed struggle, said Castro, I reply that it is the only path to liberation. At least in the case of our country, we have no other path.
No había otro camino.
In July 1953, Castro launched an attack on an army barracks near Santiago de Cuba. He was arrested and put on trial. His speech from the dock became the manifesto for his subsequent revolution.
Its final words are the famous ones, where he said to the judges, "Gentlemen, you may condemn me, but history will absolve me."
Castro was released from prison during an amnesty after serving 19 months of his sentence. He moved to Mexico, where he met up with Ernesto Che Guevara. They returned to Cuba in a leaky motor cruiser designed to hold 12 passengers, but crammed with over 80 revolutionaries. The group began a guerrilla war against the Batista regime from their base in the Sierra Maestra mountains.
Raúl, his brother as well, and Che Guevara turned out to be very, very good tacticians for guerrilla warfare and very good leaders of their men. And so they were able to survive by hitting and running and by surviving. The survival was actually crucial because the word got out very quickly that he'd been killed in the landing. They managed to get Herbert Matthews, a New York Times journalist, up into the Sierra to interview Fidel, take photographs, and then he went back and said, actually, he's not dead. This is what he's doing.
Fidel Castro. From this studio in Havana, you are about to see Fidel Castro, leader of the successful rebel forces who overthrew the dictatorship of General Batista.
When they finally took power, did they take revenge on Batista's supporters?
His instructions were clear. Take control and prevent reprisals. In other words, the idea was that it should be the guerrilla army, the rebel army, who did the arrests, who did the trials, and did the executions.
Thousands of people fled the country, fearing persecution, and hundreds of other people were put in prison and labour camps, weren't they?
They were, but that was over a long process, a long period of time. Mostly it was the middle class that left, who could see what was happening. They could see the writing on the wall. The number of people locked up varies enormously depending on who you ask. Fidel himself at one stage admitted 20,000 what were called political prisoners. The figures have varied enormously over the years.
The CIA made many attempts to finish him off, didn't they, in quite bizarre ways?
They did, and I'm not quite sure quite how true those are. What I mean by that is those arguments came out, those versions came out in the 1970s, post-Watergate, post-Allende, when the CIA was going out of its way to show that it actually wasn't quite as bad as people thought. So I have a strong suspicion that some of those stories...
What, like the exploding cigar?
Exactly, that some of those were actually designed to distract attention from the CIA itself.
Cuba countered American sanctions by forming close economic and military links with the Soviet Union. In April 1961, the CIA backed a group of Cuban exiles to invade the island at the Bay of Pigs. Castro's troops fought off the attack, but it underlined the island's potential vulnerability to an American invasion.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
We're interested, obviously, to hear more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was obviously a standoff between the US and the Soviet Union. What was Castro's role during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
His role in the first place was, of course, agreeing to take the missiles. It made some sort of sense because it would guarantee, actually, that there would not be another invasion. And, of course, one thing that came out of the missile crisis was the American promise not to invade. But actually, in the standoff, Fidel had absolutely no involvement whatsoever, which frustrated him enormously and angered him because he has subsequently and very quickly accused the Soviet Union of betraying Cuba, not because they didn't use the missiles, but he also wanted sanctions, economic sanctions, removed. And that, of course, he never got.
It's been interesting this week to hear what people have said about him. For some, a brutal dictator who terrorized his people. For others, a kind of saviour of Cuba, a kind of hero. Where do you stand on that polarized debate?
We can see exactly why both sides took those views. I think the population that moved out in the 1960s, particularly the ones who were politically opposed, saw Cuba changing before their eyes and saw a Cuba emerging which they felt was not Cuban. Equally, those who stayed, you can see precisely why they admired Fidel, because what they got out of it was protection, they got out of it full employment, they got housing. So the majority of the population benefited enormously in the 60s and subsequently.
But not in the 90s.
The 90s, of course, was the collapse of the economy, and that's when they saved it by bringing in tourism, by allowing self-employment, using emigrants' remittances, and by also encouraging foreign investment, something that Fidel wouldn't have encouraged before.
Así entendemos los revolucionarios cubanos.
And what's his legacy? Would he recognize the Cuba that is about to emerge, or the Cuba that will be there in 10, 15 years?
I have little doubt the embargo is actually going to stay. And as long as that's the case, then that underlying nationalism will remain. But the interesting thing is most of the leadership, and some of those leaders are still the ex-guerrillas, are likely to hang on to as much of that original project as they can, with a fair degree of support for most Cubans who don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Que con combatientes cubanos podrá contar el movimiento revolucionario en cualquier rincón de la tierra.
Here's a little more nonsense from the Miami hero with a lady calling him a cantankerous old man. Right. Him and his buddy, that murderous thug Che Guevara.
With a ragtail band of less than 200 followers, Fidel and his brother Raúl staged an abortive attack on Moncada Army Barracks in Santiago. It won Castro a 15-year prison sentence and a new reputation. At his trial, Castro made his memorable "History Will Absolve Me" speech, in which he gave expression to the ideals of freedom and justice that have long inspired the Cuban people. Castro's speech was his manifesto, the goals of the revolution he would lead. At a New Year's Eve party at Camp Columbia, Batista announced that he would step down to avoid further bloodshed. That same night, Batista and his family fled to the Dominican Republic. Cuba belonged to Fidel Castro.
In some ways, Fidel Castro may become a far more potent symbol for the Cuban Revolution in his death than when he was alive. It will be easy to edit out the abuses and some of the more unfortunate chapters. In his death, he will forever be that young revolutionary firebrand who stood up to the United States, who brought universal health care to the island, who brought literacy, free education to Cuba, rather than a cantankerous old man who was often a loose cannon in the end. It didn't take long for Fidel Castro to exhibit his strongman tendencies. In this interview, he talks about the ordered executions of Batista loyalists.
It's possible they execute more people than those we are executing, because Batista men killed about 20,000, and I suppose those who are criminals we are going to punish are not more than 400.
On January 3rd, 1961, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. 3 months later, CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed on a stretch of beach in what became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was supposed to spark a popular uprising against Castro. It failed miserably. By the end of that year, Castro declared himself a Marxist-Leninist. In 1962, Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis placed the Soviet Union and the United States on the verge of nuclear war. Within 5 years of the revolution, the exodus of Cubans fleeing the island had grown exponentially. The first of many planes, and what became known as the Freedom Flights, landed in Miami on December 1st, 1965. Another massive exodus happened in 1980, when more than 125,000 Cubans left by sea in the Mariel boat lift. In 1994, tens of thousands of Cubans again flung themselves to the sea in an attempt to reach the United States. Most of them settled in South Florida. In 2006, Castro suffered a health crisis that nearly killed him, and he ceded power to his younger brother Raúl. And it was Raúl, not Fidel Castro, who greeted an American president on Cuban soil when Barack Obama visited in 2016. The two countries restored diplomatic relations the previous year in 2015. Castro never particularly warmed to the new relationship with the United States, and after Obama's visit, he wrote, "We don't need the empire to give us anything." As he approached his 90th birthday, Castro attended the Communist Party Congress in April 2016. He suggested it might be the last time he would address the delegates.
A todos nos llegará nuestro turno.
Castro will forever be a controversial figure, both admired and detested. He made history, but whether history will absolve him remains a question.
Sounds like another useful idiot to me. Yeah, full employment, universal health care, and literacy, which we're not even sure exist, at the expense of thousands imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Fidel, by the way, had his personal health care completely botched. All you have to know is that the hearse that was carrying Fidel's ashes across Cuba broke down and had to be carried by soldiers. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. Since so many South Floridians were dancing at the news of Fidel's death, we're going to play this song by a man who was born in Spain but lived in Cuba for his early life. He left way before Fidel's revolution, but his music was Cuban. This is Desi Arnaz's rival, Xavier Cugat, with Cuban Mambo.